Hello, my name's Matt Schmittdiel, and welcome to Global Journalist, a show by journalists for journalists. Let's jump straight into today's story, Hong Kong. Since its days as a British colony, the semi-autonomous city has been a beacon of light for press freedom in Asia. It has managed to boast a robust and largely independent free press and held up basic standards of democracy since its inception. However, what if I told you all of this has been practically undone, not in just the last few years, but in literally the last 3 months? When Hong Kong was handed back over to China in 1997, the one country, two systems principle was established as the foundation for this agreement. This agreement is called the Basic Law, or Hong Kong's mini constitution. The importance of this law is that it protects Hong Kong's rights for two things: freedom of assembly, and our main topic today, freedom of speech, something which doesn't exist in the mainland of China. I spoke with reporters in Hong Kong who say the pressure from the Chinese government continues on the same path. Hong Kong's freedom of the press could be headed in a dark direction. In the latest World Freedom Index, Hong Kong fell from 73rd place in 2019 to 80th place in 2020. Reporters Without Borders says the drop in 7 places was due to many acts of violence committed against the media during last year's pro-democracy demonstrations. Today, we're taking a look at two very specific measures: the newly imposed national security law and a new recognition system by police on who they say is not considered a journalist. We're going to take a look at how these rules are affecting the ability of reporters, foreign and domestic, to work under these new pressures. First, let's take a look at the national security law. The law makes it easy to crack down on protesters and reduces city autonomy. It criminalizes 4 major acts. Let's go through them really quick, okay? Secession, breaking away from the country; subversion, undermining the power of the authority of the central government; terrorism, using violence or intimidation against people; and collusion with foreign and external forces. Each Hong Kong journalist we've spoken to says they're all experiencing uncertainty in their daily lives, and especially in their profession, because of the national security law, which rolled out on June 30th. Mary Hoy is a reporter based in Hong Kong who works for courts, and this is what she had to say about the national security law.
One of the things that I have to constantly remind myself of during my daily life, during the work week, is that things have changed very, very drastically from before we had the national security law to now under the national security law. And sometimes it is quite easy to forget that things have changed a lot and that we live in an entirely different reality now, essentially under an authoritarian regime.
The independent pro-democracy newspaper, Hong Kong Free Press, cites several concerns about the law, specifically Article 9 that proposes guidance, supervision, and regulation of the media. Another large problem with how the law is just how open-ended the language is.
What you would previously think were kind of fairly mundane conversations that just so happen to touch on quote-unquote sensitive issues, just because the national security law is written in such a vague and undefined way that anything that you say may be used against you under that national security law.
The arrest of media tycoon and Beijing critic Jimmy Lai on August 10th served as the first major watershed moment for press freedom in Hong Kong since the enactment of the national security law. At the same time, 200 police officers raided the newsroom of Apple Daily, a pro-democracy and opposition news outlet Lai founded in 1995. What journalist Steve Vines calls one of the last major organizations in the area that hasn't effectively come under the influence of Beijing.
It is worth mentioning is the pressure on Radio Television Hong Kong, which is the public broadcaster. And they've installed a new committee to oversee its operations, which effectively is a political control committee. I mean, the pro-China people here are very agitated about RTHK because they want it to be a propaganda arm of the government. They don't understand why public funds should be given to finance an independent broadcaster. You know, their concept of public broadcasting is it should be like in China,
AFP revealed that 3 officers paid a discreet visit to local newsroom of Nikkei, the Japanese financial newspaper, that very same day. The reason, according to a source present who spoke to AFP on condition of anonymity, was an advert placed in Nikkei a year ago calling for international support for pro-democracy protest. Hoy says another cause for concern that might not be as flashy as police raids are some changes in top management at Now TV and iCable, both previously regarded as relatively independent news operations. Hoy says the new managers are either regarded as pro-Beijing or less qualified than those they replaced. It's worth noting that everything we just talked about so far has been happening local to Hong Kong. Now, the national security law is causing just as many problems for foreign correspondents too. William Young is a Taiwanese freelance journalist and a correspondent for Germany's Deutsche Welle News. Young was on the ground covering Hong Kong for several months during the height of the anti-extradition bill protest. He's used to being on the front lines, but due to COVID-19, budget cuts, and now the national security law, he is stuck in Taiwan and out of Hong Kong.
Like adding everything together, and also just the unknown nature of whether, like how I might be affected by the national security law. I have been advised by all my employers that I should try not to go back to Hong Kong just yet.
But for reporters who are residents of Hong Kong and working for foreign media, they can't get their citizenship revoked. So what kind of action can the government take then?
Well, if the government can go after foreign correspondents by taking away their visas, what other option does that leave them if they want to target local Hong Kong reporters working for foreign media, myself being one of those people? If it's not the visa, then what else will they go for if they decide to target that segment of the press? I don't have an answer, but it's definitely a question that's hanging over my head.
Keith Richburg is a former correspondent for the Washington Post and now a journalism professor at the University of Hong Kong. He says that the government immigration services used its visa policy to restrict the number of journalists in the city. It's something brand new to Hong Kong.
Well, what we see is particularly American correspondents have been targeted, but I think that's partly because of the US-China conflict going on, because the United States under the Trump administration has really started targeting Chinese journalists living in the US.
Back in May, the US had imposed a 90-day limit on work visas for Chinese journalists. In retaliation, the Chinese government imposed similar sanctions.
Journalist associations here, like the Foreign Correspondents Club, have complained to the Foreign Ministry office here in Hong Kong about this. Their response has always been, you shouldn't talk to us, you should talk to Washington.
In July, the New York Times relocated a large part of its Hong Kong bureau's office to Seoul, South Korea, citing the growing concern of the sweeping power of the national security law.
And we also see other media outlets either considering to base their journalists somewhere else, or seeking possibilities of having an alternative plan in case that their visa gets canceled or their renewal request gets denied, because that used to be the case in China, where the Chinese Foreign Ministry controls the power of approving or like ending or like revoking a press visa. That has now become the new reality here in Hong Kong.
And in September, the Chinese government stopped renewing press credentials for foreign journalists working for American news organizations, according to the Times. Now, let's talk about the other important and recent threat to Hong Kong press freedom, the new journalist accreditation system. On September 22nd, police sent a letter to 4 prominent journalist organizations detailing what seems to be another measure to restrict the free press. The letter says only journalists registered with the Government News and Media Information Service or members of internationally recognized and reputable foreign media outlets will be able to be recognized as journalists during and at protest. Listen to Hoy's and Vine's reactions when I asked him about this new rule.
Very much see it as a hit to the press in its totality.
The police just introduced these rules and said, we will now define who are journalists and who aren't journalists, is alarming in itself.
This raised alarms at the International Press Institute, which wrote a statement that the accreditation system is, quote, creating more ambiguity and potential conflicts with the police force at the front line. The IPI specifically points out how freelance media workers affiliated with the Hong Kong Journalists Association and the Hong Kong Photographers Association can potentially be expelled or even arrested from the media zone by the HKPF because they no longer are recognized by the police's ambiguous definition of a journalist. Hong Kong press unions and other associations also issued a joint statement opposing the police general orders and the ability to no longer issue press passes. Young says taking away journalism organizations' abilities to issue press passes is a major problem.
It basically narrows the circle of people who qualify to be journalists that can legally operate and cover stories on the front line without having to worry about being arrested, being jailed, being put on trial by the Hong Kong government for basically doing the most basic journalistic activities.
Fine says police aren't media experts in the first place, so why do they think they can define what a journalist is?
They've said they will only recognize renowned international media. I don't know since when they became these great experts on the international media. I don't even know what renowned means. Is the New York Times renowned? If you ask Donald Trump, he would definitely say, no, it isn't. So, these are subjective and ridiculous criteria.
Hoy and Vines say citizen journalism was vital in covering last year's protest.
As journalists, we depend on everyone's work and we build on each other's reporting. Some of the most pivotal moments of the protests last year were captured by citizen journalists, student journalists, and a lot of that material and a lot of that information was crucial for the more quote-unquote established publications depended on to further the coverage and the reporting.
They know perfectly well that most of the most powerful images from the protests, most of the really gritty on-the-ground reporting of what happened during the protests came from these online outlets, if you like, citizen journalism.
And so, the police, by coming in and saying, we're no longer going to recognize publications accredited by the Hong Kong Journalists Association, and kind of in one fell swoop, completely doing away with the foremost media organization in Hong Kong, really wants to try and undercut this entire ecosystem.
They are, to put it bluntly, fearless, have great respect for their work.
Anonymity seems to be the new normal for some of these reporters as they struggle to get interviews with sources being comfortable using their real names.
I talk to who would rather not have their full names in stories, or even potentially identifying details like profession and age.
A lot of us basically now give anonymity to most of our sources, or we suggest that they should.
Hoy says the Hong Kong press corps have not had to think about these issues because they've been relatively free for so long.
And so we really haven't had the experience of trying to deal with that kind of level of taking precautions and needing to take extra precautions to protect your sources when you're coming up against a state that is intent on probably going after your sources.
Vine says even he is looking over his shoulder now.
I just tell you, I walk in the streets and when I see a group of policemen, I get worried.
Protests on National Day, October 1st, saw the first major public test of the new journalist registration rules in effect, according to Radio Television Hong Kong. 4 journalists from online media outlets were questioned, and 3 of them were fined for violating a ban on gatherings of more than 4 people.
You've got the COVID-19 restrictions still in place. I believe much of that is political. For example, they've extended these the gathering ban on more than 4 people. They've extended that through October 1st. And use the gathering restriction as a tool to keep protests off the streets. They can keep people from gathering for the protest against the National Day holiday on October 1st.
Compared to protests last summer, the attendance at the anti-government protest on National Day were low.
That's true. Not many people did because, it is scary. A lot of people who, 2 million people were out in the streets in June last year, a lot of those people are going, you know, I've got families, I've got jobs, I can't afford to lose them. So, you know, if you're saying you're going to arrest vast numbers of people, it does have an effect.
The situation in Hong Kong is changing for citizens, journalists, and protesters alike. So as a reporter who is sent out to cover protest, Hoy, Young, Vines say you have to look for other forms of resistance.
Only opposition newspaper that still exists, mainstream opposition newspaper, Apple Daily, has seen its circulation soar. But not only that, but citizens have been taking out these small ads every single day of the week as a way of providing support to the newspaper. People engage in these, they're not really demonstrations, but it's very touching. People go to central areas of Hong Kong, sit there reading the Apple Daily. They're making a point.
Richburg tells his journalism students that they can still practice journalism, but it's going to be tough. But he says the people of Hong Kong are resilient.
I always put my faith in people of Hong Kong. They're tough. They're not giving up. I mean, many are looking to emigrate or go elsewhere, but many more are saying no, we're going to stay here and fight. So, you know, I always put my money on the people of Hong Kong.
Young believes there are multiple layers of risk and challenges all generation and ages of people in Hong Kong will have to face. But press freedom will ultimately come down to one final decision.
They have two choices, I think, to decide. One choice is to keep fighting and keep resisting, but, you know, like risking, like stepping, you know, onto the so-called invisible landmine, like placed by the government under the name of national security, or they, you know, like became everyone else in mainland China, you know, to exercise self-censorship and slowly destroy the values and the spirit of Hong Kong that, you know, the world has been fascinated by the city for decades. And I think this is the inevitable destiny that Hong Kong will have to face.
The reality is that press freedom in Hong Kong is uncertain. No one knows how the charges under the national security law against journalists are going to hold up in court until it actually happens. The one certainty we can draw confidently from these conversations with these journalists is that there will always be dedicated journalists and journalism professors, like those we spoke with, which will always give a voice to the voiceless and keep the battle for press freedom alive. Thanks for joining us on Global Journalist. I'm Matt Schmittdiel, and we'll see you next time. Since the taping of this episode, here are a few headlines you should be aware about. That's it for this edition of Global Journalist, produced by Missouri School of Journalism at the studios of the Reynolds Journalism Institute. For producers Annie Lee, Zephyrus Lee, and executive producer Trevor Hook, I'm reporter Matt Schmittdiel, and thanks to our director Travis McMillen. And thank you all for listening.